And
sorry.
no problem, no problem. And it is a little bit, I find it a little bit, it's not really ironic, but I guess it's a little bit interesting that I would be talking about teams with a bunch of military folks, because I think probably you know that the military has been pretty instrumental in developing a lot of team science. And they have also provided a ton of data to like the civilian world about teams for further analysis. And some of you may or may not have experienced that. I was never military. I have family who was military. I've heard conflicting reports about experiences of people in teams in the military. But generally speaking, why would I have anything to say about it that you guys don't already know? Well, let's see if I can actually forward this. Hold on, I might have to stop sharing in order to. Did I have this problem before where I couldn't present and share at the same time? Let's try it this way. Aha, there we go. Okay, so who am I and where do I come from? I am from ThoughtWorks. We're a software development consultancy. So we go in where companies and organizations have either not been able to figure out the technology that they need, and we come in there guns blazing to do that for them, or we help them replace giant legacy systems that have fallen on hard times, or perhaps 25-year-old Oracle or SAP systems that aren't creaky and not working anymore. I personally do coaching. My job is mostly as a storyteller. My actual title is product lead, and I do a lot with product strategy and operationalization. So that means that somebody has a great idea and we have some willing technologists who can create it, and there's somebody in the middle there who can start to translate those requirements and keep the customer in mind and so forth. So, for your purposes, I'm also a job changer. I started at ThoughtWorks about 6 years ago. Well, actually, it's just over 6 years now. Took a break, came back, and that has enabled me to have some different eyes, I think, on the way that you can like ease yourself into the technical careers that you're about to be starting. And because I've been consulting for this long now, I've also had the benefit of learning from a whole lot of different kinds of companies, what they've had to try to do to adapt to the modern era, what they're trying to do in terms of turning their own IT departments around right now. So I really do enjoy my role as an observer, and I've been able to collect a lot of anecdotal evidence for you as you enter into your careers and your interviews coming up, that might help orient you in space to where you might be headed. So that is what I would like to talk about with you today. Also, just personally, I like business history. You'll hear it coming out once in a while. I've tried to like hone this down so it's actually only an hour, but sometimes I go a little over because I get really excited about the business history aspects of this. Behavioral nudges, if any of you are interested in behavioral economics or Dick Thaler's stuff coming out of the University of Chicago, super interesting way to be influential. And then karaoke and quilting, if any of you are headed out karaoke singing anytime soon. So what we'll talk about today here a little bit is why teams matter at organizations, and a little bit of business history, and then a little bit more about what you might be stepping into as you join your new employers. And then how teams form, because teams are actually really predictable, which is something that if you guys took, leadership training, or if you were in any kind of organizational psychology classes, you probably know some of this, but this is just to start you thinking about it in the context of where you're going now, as opposed to the teams that or organizations that you may have been in, and some tools. So the original reason I was doing a Teams talk at all was because for Bravo Company, they were having trouble with their group work. They were having trouble like figuring out who was doing what with their group projects. And I had actually done feedback session prior to that one, but they were like, hey, do you have anything about how to collaborate like in these technical spaces? And I was like, sure. So that's where this came from. So these tools at the end here were kind of aimed at Bravo Company, but I think that, or Bravo Platoon, I guess, but they've been worthwhile for the all of the platoons since then. And then something that I have done also as a result of feedback that I've gotten from folks in these calls are questions for future employers, because people were like, okay, cool, what can I do with this? I'm going to just end up at an employer and then I'm going to have to figure it out there. But there are questions that you can ask as you go through your interview processes. And I'll caveat that by saying it might not matter to you at all for your first job out of Code Platoon, right? You might just be saying, I'll go wherever they'll pay me to do this work. And that's totally cool. But there are some environments that you might prefer, right? And we can start to distinguish those environments, and there are some questions that might help you get there. I'm also really informal as a person. And so if you want to stop, ask me a question, feel free. I can't see all of you, but I can read the chats a little bit as I go, or people who are willing to are welcome to break into my monologue here and ask a question or ask it on behalf of someone who's not as brave if you want. So that is the plan. But my hidden agenda is also to make a plea in the technical space for soft skills, which are kind of like widely recognized, like, yeah, soft skills are also good. But I don't think people really recognize how important they are unless they really think of teams as like empathetic bodies. So even in your new career, consider the soft skills that you've developed over the course of your life so far to be an equal participant in the value that you bring to your employers as you go forward. If you manage to be good at technology and you are empathetic and a good team builder, you're like a valuable unicorn, especially right now when there's such a job crunch on. Keep that in mind. All right. So the poor Bravo platoon, having trouble with their group projects, came to view group projects probably as something of a punishment. I too, when I was in grad school, thought like group projects were horrible. And partly that was because I was a part-time student, but full-time working still. And many of my colleagues at school were going to the part-time program, but they weren't doing anything else. So it was like their whole lives were focused on the 2 classes they were taking in a semester. And I just didn't have that bandwidth to pay attention to it that much. So we had really kind of different goals. And that, as we will discover, is one of the very most important things about how teams form well. So let me ask you this question. I'll just kind of open it up to everybody. What kind of place have you thought about where you want to work? What kind of thing you want to do with your technology after you leave Code Platoon?
I'm sorry. Go ahead, James.
Thanks, Zach. I'll be quick. I was going to say that I would really like to go work with the programs that I used during my 20-year career and try to make those better for future sailors.
Ah, cool. Okay, so you want to give back to the military, like be a contractor with the military kind of thing?
Yeah, like in a way, exactly.
Awesome.
I want to move out of IT and into software development. So my current role, or what my current role was more of like building servers, help desk, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to push more into the development side.
Gotcha. Yeah. Anyone else?
I see. I had a similar answer as Zach. Is that like I did a little bit of IT, and it tended, at least the jobs I had, tended to be kind of like you're alone, not really the team aspect, not kind of really being pushed to do anything.
Yeah.
At your limit. So.
Yeah, that's so several of you have kind of been, or it sounds like on the kind of edges of what you're perceiving as the like kind of technical sphere. And that's where I was too, right? I was right on the edge of being like project management, product management, where I had been working prior. And I had a bunch of experience in insurance and risk management and like kind of miscellaneous back office stuff. And I always felt like there's got to be a better way to do this, right? There's just got to be a better way. A lot of my job at that time had been cobbling together resources from people who owed me a favor or people who like could spare me a couple hours a week or something like that to get things done. I really had to kind of self-serve in that way. So there's a lot of reasons that I think, you know, things that people may want to do with their Code Platoon. Oh no, why does it keep doing this to me? It won't let me forward. Hang on a second, I'm sorry guys. Trying again. I might have to leave it out of presentation mode just so it doesn't irritate us all. Try again. So these are some of the reasons I've heard before, right? I want either something that's steady and reliable because no technology is not going anywhere, right? Like this is a long-term path for us. Someplace that you can innovate, right? And then maybe that gets towards like, I don't want to be in IT anymore. I want to be with the people who are kind of like making those things happen. Where I can be an invaluable expert. This is something that we run into a lot, where somebody in the organization is an invaluable expert and nobody else knows what they know. And that's actually very problematic for a lot of companies. They've become the one person that knows how to keep that creaky Oracle system running. And those companies have what we referred to before as the bus problem. Like if that guy gets hit by a bus, you guys are going to be in big trouble. Now we prefer to call it the lottery problem. If that guy wins the lottery, you're in equal problematic space, right? So some people perceive of the developer as like, I can be left alone and still make some good money, right? Like I don't necessarily have to be super like extrovert on a team and doing that. That is also true. Some folks want to take this and they don't actually want to be a technologist, but they maybe want to manage technologists, or they want to join entrepreneurial areas, or be part of something that can really change the world. Or as you said, to be able to change the job that you had before, right? Like you went through it for 20 years and you knew that it was kind of painful in some ways, and you probably have some great ideas about how to fix it. And the technology is going to be able to give you that power. And in some ways, yeah, what William Gibson said probably close to 50 years ago now is still true, which is the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. So the reason I ask this is because these are all very valid reasons or valid job goals, right? And these are different organizations. This is a different kind. Several of these would be the kind of place where maybe you work in a department, or it's a little bit more siloed. You just want to be left alone. You want to do your job up until 5 o'clock, like punch your card and head home and hang out with your family or your dog or your softball team or whatever it is. Some of these are a lot more time consuming or passion based. And there are different employers out there, and those are the kinds of things that you can start to look for as you move through your interview processes. So a moment, if you will, indulge me in my hobby horse of business history. And I'm not going to go very deep into this. It's a very superficial view, right? But you hear a lot like, oh, businesses are facing increased complexity. Like, well, what does that mean? And what does it mean to you? In the past, there were plenty of complicated systems, and a complicated system might be something like a factory floor at the turn of the century that had many, many moving parts and even human interaction in that system. But once you started that process going, there were only a few ways that it was going to end up. Either that widget was going to make it all the way through the system, or it was going to stop halfway through because the system broke, or the widget was going to be defective and maybe get kicked off the line, or maybe somebody didn't know how to run the machinery, right? There's a kind of a finite set of problems with a complicated system. This, by the way, is a watch gear. So it's got a lot of tiny parts and a lot of interactions, but it's generally understood what's going to happen at the end of that watch, the cycle of this watch's process. Versus this, which is an economic map of Ireland, imports and exports based on their top imports and exports. Each of these colors being like kind of an area of their economics. And so as you can see, this is the kind of thing that a complex system represents, where if you start something at one end of this map, it's very difficult to understand what's going to end up happening with that course of action. So the general idea here is that in a complex system, you don't know what's going to happen, even if you start with the same conditions and the same participants as you did last week or yesterday or the last time this ran through. We've seen a lot of this, right, with the supply chain disruptions and stuff over the course of COVID. And I think any of you who worked in logistics in the military will be well familiar with this kind of thing. But when we talk about increasing complexity, it's not just that everything is rapidly changing, which is kind of one of the common things that you'll hear about the modern era, right? Like everything changes, it's like quadrilaterally increasing rate of change. But it's also that we have this increasing interdependence, and we have many, many more participants in our systems than we used to have. Like I personally have worked on teams where I have a work day with people in China and Turkey and Brazil. And that was not really feasible in the era before email, if you think about that, which is only 40 years ago or so, depending on where you worked, of course. Some people had access a lot before I did. So this is, in a complex system, there's a problem for managers, which is that this increased interdependence and uncertainty means that management can no longer stand in the center of a factory floor with a stopwatch and know what all those processes are doing and be the arbiter of truth for how that process should work. The span of control is too great. And this is true of every organization that I've gone into in the last 6 years. with the exception of ones that were like 5 people big, right? Like people who had Series B funding and wanted to pay us to help them bring an idea to life. Those were the only people who could still see all the parts of their company. Everyone else was just hoping they knew what was going on and asking people for status all the time. So this has brought us to the limits of our decision making as individuals or even as like groups of C-level managers. So what can we do about it? Right now, we've acknowledged like the world is really truly a different place than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And organizations are just now catching up with a lot of ideas that came out of some team studies of the military, but also academic psychology and sociology studies about how people work together most efficiently. So there's this perfect storm of a very complex system in which we're all living and working now. The rise of the knowledge workers, which you guys probably were before, because most people in America, at least, have been knowledge workers since post-World War II, right? That's the trend. A lot of people still are working in different other jobs, service jobs or manual jobs, but the trend has overwhelmingly been towards people becoming knowledge workers, going to college and getting out of that and using their brains specifically and not necessarily making widgets anymore, right? Something else that we saw as a result of COVID is there are not many widgets being made in America anymore. So business can't keep up with that complexity. They can't know everything anymore. Mastery lives at the far nodes, right? So now the people who are at the very edges of this system out here at the edges of these nodes, those are the folks who actually know what's going on out there. And in a world where the rate of change is quadrilaterally increasing, those people are best poised to take advantage of opportunities in an ever-changing market or an ever-changing world. There is the delay, the cost of delay of trying to send information signals from the edges of this network into the middle to some centralized body that makes decisions and sends back instructions. That's just not really feasible anymore. And I think it's been true in the military, as far as I know, for some time. There have been definitely like, you know, some bodies within the external parts of the organizations who are kind of enabled or authorized or empowered to make these kinds of decisions and do things at the fringes. And then some people are very much still like kind of mired in the bureaucracy of the traditional military units. And I at some point, if we could have a cocktail, I'd love to hear what your guys' experiences were in that regard, because I never really get to talk to you about how you experience teams in the military, but one of these days I will. So we talked a little bit about knowledge worker, and one of the corollaries there is knowledge workers had very different management requirements than people who worked in factories and made widgets, who were very, very goal oriented, meaning I'm going to hit my goal of 10,000 widgets this month, and that's what I'm incentivized to do. Actually, knowledge workers they want mastery, autonomy, and purpose. They want to be really good at what they do. They want to be left alone to do it. And they want to know the reason why they're doing it so that they can dedicate their brain resources to doing it well and doing it in a way that takes advantage of those opportunities out at the fringes. So if you're a manager of these kind of people, like fast tip also, that a lot of the articles that were written about how millennials are so hard to manage because they want to bring their true authentic selves to work, that's really just about managing knowledge workers, which has been happening now for 70 years. But people are just coming around to the idea that this is a real thing. So you as a knowledge worker want mastery, autonomy, and purpose. You want to be left alone to do the job you know you can do well. Unfortunately, if you're the only person out on that fringe, you're the guy who knows the creaky Oracle system. And if you win a lottery, then you're going to leave, and that's going to leave the organization high and dry. So the way to mitigate that risk for organizations is to imbue that team with that power, the team at the fringes, because then there will be somebody to carry on the flag if that person leaves. So teams have been emerging now for maybe 20 or 30 years, very explicitly in organizations and very explicitly in technical organizations as the fundamental unit of organization and the best answer to managing this uncertainty and interdependence. So among the many people who have studied this, there are a whole bunch of studies about this, but Google did one, and they did it in 2016, about what makes our best high-performing teams. Like, what's unique to the high-performing teams? Do they all go to lunch together? Do they all have dogs? Do they all have kids? Do they all not have kids? Do they hang out after work? What is the common bond? How do we constitute the perfect team over and over again? Because from Google, this was a very quantifiable and valuable thing to know, right? They wanted to be able to recobble together their Franken teams that were in the range of 25% more effective, which they described as, they had more output, which led to more potential hits rather than misses of the output of those development teams. So it was a very huge number for Google, right? Well worth them trying to explore this on the coattails of many other people who had been exploring it for years in academia or in the military, and kind of the growing trend of trying to understand how to put people together so they're efficient. So this quote is just about, if any of you ever read The Wisdom of the Crowds or any of those kind of books, this is very similar. Group psychology. Groups are better at things, right? Groups they find solutions better. They recognize problems faster. They report higher job satisfaction. So even if you're very high performing knowledge worker and you're left alone to do your job, you probably will report a lower job satisfaction than somebody who's in a similarly high performing team. And this too is a quantifiable value to employers because there's a cost to churn in employees, right? When people dance around and leave their jobs all the time. It's not just the institutional knowledge they're losing, they also have to replace that person, and it's expensive. So I probably don't have to convince you that this was the structure for a long time, and it still is a structure in many of the organizations I go to, which is command and control. And in old-timey project management speak, you'll hear this referred to as waterfall, because somebody makes a decision up at the top of this orange pentagon guy, and then these slightly larger, domain people who have clawed their way up to middle management send that message down their line. And it's very infrequent that the worker bees down here of different shapes and colors actually work together on things. Sometimes they do, but it's got to be because of a mandate from on high, basically. And so this is a very different structure from the kind of team that responds well to the reality of our complex systems. Our complex systems require somebody who are nimble and cross-functional. So cross-functional is a huge element to agile teams. And you can see that this team is comprised of pretty much 0 managers, right? I don't have a boss at ThoughtWorks. I work on a series of very fluid teams like this as one of these shapes. And typically we have, some number of developers, and we all work together to make the product go. So this is somebody who's just mentioning the JSOC.
Sorry, that was just a random comment about the colors you used.
Oh no!
Yeah. They all look like a service.
That's awesome. No, that's interesting. I thought you were referring to so General Stanley McChrystal in the 2006, I guess, or whatever. He was a big proponent of this kind of team, and it was partly because all of these agencies after 9/11 were thrown together to interact with each other and provide military intelligence. But they hadn't really hammered out the rules of engagement as I understood it. So his book, Team of Teams, is really interesting. And I actually have taken slides out of this related to him, but that I think is a fascinating story about how that happened across lines of the military. Anyway, they too created this kind of team, this kind of autonomous team. And Harvard is trying to brand this kind of team as 4D. You might hear 4D, but only from people who read Harvard Business Review. So you generally will see this as an agile team or an autonomous team or a product team, something like that. So maybe this is the kind of team that you want to work on when you get into the employers where you're going, maybe. And maybe you will be lucky enough to find an employer that actually does this and does it well. This is just a slightly increased view of the interdependent parts within a team like this and how they can overlap. We'll talk a little bit about how teams are reliable to each other, right? People become very reliant to each other. And so I will send this deck out, by the way, with the links as a separate reading list in case you care to read them. So you can read all the little words on here. But I came in as a BA, and one of the great benefits to employees of a team like this is the cross-pollination that you get from your peers who are better at things than you are when you're there as one of these roles and you get to work with someone who's a really good CX or UX designer or somebody who's been a really good product owner. I've learned a ton. So I started out in this kind of pinky peach shade over here, but I've definitely moved into both the pinks and the yellows and a little bit of this UX blue. I have done some testing, but I would mostly do manual testing. I'm really not a technical person at all. So I've learned a lot about concepts from my development peers, and this is a great educational space to be in, this kind of cross-pollinated team. This, of course, is a QA's perspective because they sit in the middle. So some QA made this diagram that we're still using at ThoughtWorks years later. So we've seen one kind of organization that you might walk into, right? Which is this, very kind of traditional organization. And this isn't going anywhere, people. Like, this is going to be around for a long time. And this is job security for people like me who come in where organizations are trying to transform into a digital organization after 100 years of not being that. And they're like, what do we do? And we're like, well, you might need to reorient your silos into teams. And they're like, okay, we can't do that. What else could we do? Right? Like, that's a really hard cultural shift for people to make. Typically, these are siloed by function. So you might be, like you say, in an IT department or a delivery department or an engineering department. Or maybe you're part of a product team like I am. And then you might get assigned out to teams, or you might have responsibility to 4 or 5 different teams or something like that. This does kind of still imply that somebody has control over this process and that decisions flow downhill. There's a little bit more room for maneuvering here just nowadays because, people work remotely from home. People are a little more used to the idea of an autonomous teams. But oh, that's true. Yes, flat organization. Well, you're right, because those folks clawed their way up to middle management, and they're very reluctant to relieve to lose that power that they've earned, they feel. And you're right also that a lot of senior management, like people in the C levels who are reading the same documents I'm reading about team building and about how, efficiency and product development, they want to do this. And certainly the people like down yonder, they know that there's a better way to do things, right? It's usually the middle management that we call the frozen middle for that exact reason, who are incapable of making that jump. A lot of them are just hanging on till retirement. They don't really need to be bothered. Yeah. So, all right. So that's what you might walk into, or you might walk into something that's a little bit closer to what we would perceive of as product teams or agile development teams, where everybody here is kind of an autonomous unit, and they might respond to what I would think of as a committee, like a C-level committee. We, for instance, at ThoughtWorks have an office of the COO, because for the same reason that we don't really want one guy to know everything about the creaky Oracle thing, we also don't want one person running the show, because this is a huge succession problem for organizations. So a lot of times you'll see committees at the top of these kinds of organizations. We do have a CEO now, though, since we went public. Wow, is our CEO technical, one person. Also at these organizations, and this you may know as the Spotify model. If any of you have seen this is a link, by the way, to a little cartoon that they did way back in the day about how their pods were created, about these cross-functional teams. It's really fascinating. There's like 2 cartoons that are about 10 minutes and well worth your time to check out, just because it's so interesting how they came up with this. They weren't the first people using it. This has been kind of a common Silicon Valley thing since the 90s, but they were the first people to brand it, into this pod model thing. You may also see that there's less unidirectional flow of information in this system, that it's much more likely that the central organization will be providing goals and visions, and that the folks out at the margins here are actually sending back information about what the solution is for that, and that they're there in the space with their customers or their processes or whatever it is. They're the experts in that space, and they come up with the solution. So this is kind of an idealized view of what this could look like. And sometimes you will still see centralized functions in these organizations, something like Devops, right? We have come in and done Devops, which if you're not familiar, what we have done is build a one-touch spin up of environments, for instance, so that all of these teams no longer have to spend a bunch of time on their own infrastructure. They can kind of just come get it as a package deal from a centrally located team who will build that for a bunch of different languages or something like that. You sometimes see it also with UX, which I think is really unfortunate. Like that might be customer experience or user experience design. And a lot of times they get farmed out over many different teams because people think of them as only applicable during the design stage, which is horseshit, right? Like they should be there the whole time. If you really have a good customer focus, you're talking to the customer the whole time you're building something, and you're designing it with somebody who is interacting with them, right? They're testing it with them, they're giving them surveys, they're finding out how many people switched during the course of the development. So UX, unfortunately, is sometimes farmed out, but they probably shouldn't be. One of the problems with this kind of team structure, because most organizations are still very budget conscious and they want to wring out the utility, like every last drop of utility from each of their team members as they can. And so it causes a lot of interdependence across teams, which is really problematic, because if I'm 30% dedicated to 5 different teams, like guess what? Somebody's not getting my full attention somewhere. This happens very frequently to those centralized team members who get farmed out to other pieces of the organization. And the problem with this is, we talked earlier about how in a complex system, there were a lot of different participants, more than there had been before, and there was a lot of interdependence across the system. And interdependence is something that's always going to create additional friction in your system. If you have interdependence within your team, right, within that little networked team that we talked about, that's fine, because that's a span of control that can be understood and can be managed. But once it starts to expand out into this sort of blob across the organization, this is when we start to lose the efficiency of our team system. And Mark Mortensen had has discovered, doing a lot of research right now on human capital interdependence. And basically you might think of this as multitasking, right? Or multi-teaming, which some folks call it now, where you might get into your job, and if one of the questions you can ask in your interview is, am I dedicated to something or 1 or 2 things? Or am I just like 30% allocated to anybody who needs me? Because that's a very different environment from a team, and like a quote unquote team environment. And so there's some place that you're likely to end up, which is going to be some god awful hybrid of the 2 of these things. And this is because most organizations are trying to make, they're like at least making some nominal lip service type attempts to create this team structure, because some C-level guy at their organization said, hey, I read this in CEO Weekly and I think we should do it. Or somebody came from the outside world and they were like, well, at my old company, we did it this way. And so I think we should start to form these teams. And maybe they start to create those teams under their silo, right? They start to try to build these cross-functional teams. I usually walk into a company that looks something like this when I'm assigned to a new client at ThoughtWorks. There's just people who are clinging to the ways of the past. And in some cases that works fine for them. You don't have to have a legal person on your agile team necessarily. And legal department matters are very typically handled within the legal department. And that doesn't matter, right? For in most cases, unless you're trying to do some legal development, of course, and then you would want their expertise. So you might see this called Scrum or Fall, right? This is like waterfall plus Scrum, or delivery only Agile. There's kind of a popular fiction that Agile only applies to delivery teams and not actually to the whole organization, which is a little bit of a polite fiction. Or multi-teaming, that problem where you might be allocated out to multiple teams as you go. So this may make sense for you guys based on anything that you've done already in your careers or in your jobs at the military. You might, recognize yourself in one of these. And it might be that when you go to your organizations as you interview, or as you start your new jobs or your internships, you can start to map this out for yourself. You can start to be like, those guys over there, that's Scrum or Fall. These organizations here within this company are really trying to make this product team thing work, and start to decide where you want to be in that environment. So just want to pause there. I haven't been catching up with the chat at all, but any questions so far on the value of teams to organizations or why this is happening now?
Hey, Kelly, since we're just talking about the different team structures, can you talk a little bit about your experience with job satisfaction and which teams are used?
Oh, yeah.
Can you just talk about that for a second?
I'd be delighted. So I think I mentioned I'm a job changer, and I had always been kind of like trying to see over the wall, right? Like those guys look like they're so much happier, and I hated my jobs. And sometimes I would land like accidentally on a good departmental team where we all got along and we could, kind of take care of each other's stuff. When I went to ThoughtWorks, I was like euphoric, honestly, to start working in teams like this, cross-functional teams where I had so much to learn. Like there was so much meaty greatness that other people knew that I could learn. And I told some of the new folks, like I had been here, I think 5 or 6 months, and I said, they were talking about like, the wrong kind of LaCroix in the refrigerator or some dumb crap like that. And I was like, listen, people, I've been in the outside world and I know what it's like. And I'm going to do every job at this company and I'm going to die here. That's what I told them. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how much better I felt about the work. But really for me, it was very much about that cross-pollination, about getting to pick people's brains and just like see other people who were really good at what they did and be able to interact with them in a really tight way all the time. It was great. Yeah.
Thanks. I really appreciate it.
Sure. Did you have something you were thinking of? Like, do you have a specific experience you were looking for or remember?
I'm moving out of the hierarchical right now, where I've had a whole bunch of bosses in the military try and adapt the agile framework in the special operations community, and it has always fallen flat on its face. So I'm very interested to actually get into a cross-functional team. That's where I kind of want to go in the future.
Yeah, it would be hard to do agile without cross-functional teams because you're still fighting the bureaucracy of the silo, right? Like trying to fight for people's time or fight for something like that. I have definitely had people who were introduced to agile in kind of a half-assed way and therefore have a really poor view of agile. And what I tell them is like, look, this can be done incorrectly in a lot of different ways, right? It can be done poorly in a lot of different ways. In some cases, doing it poorly is still better than whatever was there. And one thing to keep in mind is that Agile is not really flavor of the month, right? Agile is just a long, it's the extension of a long history of increased efficiency models that had started in post-World War II with, systems thinking and all of that, and went all the way through, the Toyota model and operational efficiency in industrial settings through like Six Sigma, right? Like this is all just a progression through that stuff. And so I think that people don't recognize that yes, there's some big changes that Agile requires of organizations that are used to more hidebound traditions, but it's not coming out of space. It's not just like the brainchild of a bunch of people working in a garage in Silicon Valley. It's honestly like a continuation of the academic work around how to be better and more efficient organizations. And I think if people embrace that part a little bit more, they might have a better experience. Or they might be able to better enact Agile for the reasons that it's a good move, rather than just being like, well, we got out the big page of Agile and it looks like we're Agile now, so we're all transformed, hooray. Like that generally doesn't work too well. Aha, you hit my hobby horse, which was business history. Okay, but now I'm back on track. So how do teams form? Well, let's talk about what has defined your good and bad team. So Seth gave us an example of a bad team, which is he's got managers upon managers upon managers yelling at him about how autonomous he is now. Anybody else have an example of a good or bad team that you've been on?
Yeah, so I worked for a congressional campaign before I enlisted, and we had a tyrant of a campaign manager. She was very smart. She was, she expected everyone to work the same kind of obscene amount of hours that she did.
Yeah.
And so for instance, she demanded that we have on Super Bowl Sunday, she demanded that we have a in-person meeting at the office at like 7 o'clock on a Sunday. And it's just like, what the hell are you thinking? Like that. Yeah. And so, like I said, she was very smart, but she just couldn't like comprehend. She's like, I don't understand why everyone isn't working 120 hours a week on this campaign like I am. Like,
did she ever hear from anybody like, hey, it's Super Bowl Sunday, maybe people don't want to show up? Like, did anyone ever push back on her?
Yeah, so I was very close with the candidate. And so there was finally one time, because I lived about 45 minutes from the office, and she called me back. She's like, hey, we're having a sit down. I was like, oh, well, I can just hop on a call. And she was like, no, you're going to be here. And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm going home. Yeah. It was a Saturday evening. I had been doing fundraisers all weekend and I didn't feel like doing it. So, I pretty much told her, I was like, if you have a problem, you can ask the candidate. It just didn't click for her. And if you stood up to her, it's not like she could like really fire anyone. Yeah. Or at least not like the people that had been there before she was. But yeah, it was just extremely unpleasant because it was very hard to like get through to her. People have lives outside of the campaign, including the candidate. And she didn't understand it.
Wow, people like that give politics a bad name. Well, politics probably gives itself a bad name, but yes. So no empathy, right? Zero empathy being exhibited by the boss or the person in charge. Like a real, that's utterly command and control, right? There's not a lot of room for autonomous thought there or anything like that. It's really unfortunate. Anyone else? Good or bad? You've been on a bunch of teams, right? You've been on softball teams, you've been on choirs, you've been on theater troops, you've been in your military teams, you've been.
The best thing I can think of is the difference between an officer, or excuse me, a leader who's willing to admit he's wrong, and the ones who are willing to accept, an input, even if I can think of two guys that I worked for on my last ship, and one guy, I could come in and say, "Hey, sir, I think we're not doing this right, and here's why I think that." And he'll say, "Yeah, but you didn't look at this, and here's why you're going to do it the way I want you to do it." And that's the end of the story. Or other times he would say, "Okay, cool, let's take a look at that. Maybe I'm not quite right."
Mm-hmm.
And then the other guy that sat in that same seat was, "I don't care that you have the exact quote that says that we have to do it this way. You're going to do it this way." And then when it came back and things were messed up, he would say, "Well, why did you do it that way?"
Worst, the worst. So didn't provide any air cover for a decision that he made is like basically the definition of the worst kind of boss. Yeah. But what that first gentleman was doing was creating an area where you felt comfortable to ask questions and learn, right? So he was creating what we'll talk about a little bit later as psychological safety, which is a huge, huge component of a good team for sure. Anyone else? Any notions?
I like being on a, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I definitely noticed, I worked in like financial management for the Air Force, like the budget, which is a process that's the same thing that's done over year after year. There's not a lot of variability to it. But what I've noticed is that a lot of that knowledge gets kind of stalled out at the top, where it's like the people who have been doing it for years don't trust the people almost who are brand new to the process. So they're kind of watching, and then the next year comes around and there's all this wonder of why no one really knows what to do, and all the newer people are kind of lost.
Yeah, that's right. So there's the fiefdoms being created because those people have been there forever, and there's that element of like, it's just faster if I just do it than if I tell you how to do it. And if they don't trust people, that's definitely like a red flag. Obviously, if they're, why are they in the finance department if you don't trust them, first of all, like of all places. Michael, you had something, I think, too.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I love working on small teams where everybody's kind of in it to win it, and just like focused on a thing. Like to me, that can just be really fun and rewarding. And I find sometimes it can be difficult not to have a small team. Like when a small team gets, I'll say, when somebody in the small team becomes cynical about maybe the goal, then that can be really rough, because then you kind of feel like you're pulling the weight, or the other team members kind of begin to feel like they're kind of pulling the weight for somebody who should be throwing their weight into it too, and they're not. But I don't know, I seem to find it seems less common to find those teams where everybody's kind of like in it to win it and like really excited about it than the other. But that's just my personal experience.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And I think there are things, one of the things that we'll hopefully get to here is that there are things you can do to nudge that team back on track, to be a team where everyone's more in it to win it. And a lot of times it has to do with just addressing it personally with people, which is a vocabulary that not many of us have. Like, I'm going to pull you aside and I'm going to be like, hey, your constant negative comments are really dragging us down and making it harder for us to work together. Like, that sounds like, something you might have to do in preschool, not something that you have to do in your job, right? But as it turns out, that is increasingly something that we have to do in our jobs too. So there are tools to help manage that. But yeah, it's a huge drag. But you're right about the small team thing. So that's one of the benefits of these cross-functional teams, is that they are small and relatively nimble or agile. I think it was popularized at, now I'm not going to remember who did it. Was it Steve or Facebook guy, or might have been Zuckerberg, who said, teams should be no bigger than 2 pizzas. Like, if it takes more than 2 pizzas to treat your team at lunch, that's too big of a team. Now that depends on who's on your team, because I can fully eat my own pizza, like that, no problem. But so this fellow, Mark Mortensen, our friend from the couple slides back, he describes a team in an interesting way, which is a group of interdependent individuals working towards a common goal. So I think when you're saying you're in it to win it, that's the common goal part of the equation, right? But the interdependent individuals is a really interesting thing. And sometimes I'll hear from people, my best teams, everyone had each other's back. it felt like, we absolutely knew what each of us were doing. We all had our kind of assignments and we did them. So there's that interdependent quality of a good team where he describes this as the bus stop model, because you could have a common goal without being interdependent. And he says a bunch of people at a bus stop all have a common goal, right? Which is to get on the bus. However, if 3 people decide the bus is taking too long to get there and they leave, that doesn't really affect the rest of the people. That's not a team, right? And you will sometimes run into these kinds of teams, or like, managers thinking as long as we have the same common goal, we're going to march in the same direction, which is not really necessarily the case. There is an element of commitment that has to happen across a team for it to be an actual high-performing team. So I like this definition because it's sort of sneakily, elegantly right, despite being really simple. And for those of you who have been through leadership training, this will look familiar, but if you haven't, this can be like, oh my God, the key that unlocks the magical door of how to manage teams. I never knew this. I did not know this coming to ThoughtWorks, despite having gone to business school, by the way. I was like, hey guys, where was this in business school? This would have been really helpful. So organizational psychology tells us, Bruce Tuckman was a psychologist in the 60s, forming, storming, norming, performing. Folks heard about this? Not heard about this? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods, some shakes of the head. So this is very valuable. And if there's anything that you take away from this talk today, this would be the page to either screenshot or take out when I send you the deck. Teams are really predictable. And most teams will go through all 4 of these stages. And sometimes there's a 5th stage where if you really get to that fabulously high-performing team that you're a part of and you're kind of high on it, like it feels like you're weightless in some ways when you're working with a team like that. There's also a stage called mourning when that team is no longer around. And that's some people have experienced this, I think, from leaving the military, where they were on a high-performing team and then they get to civilian life and they're like, ugh, like everything's a little bit more colorless somehow. Some of those folks are just adrenaline junkies, I think, but some of them also are experiencing a mourning period for that camaraderie, esprit de corps, let us say. So forming, what is this? First day at a new school, right? You're not going to put your whole self in. You're not really in it to win it yet because you're kind of getting the lay of the land. You have some reservations. You're not putting your real personality out there. You might save some of those more colorful jokes for later, right? Like you're not telling everything to everybody at this point. And the most important thing you can do here is figure out what that common goal is, and then start to establish trust. So interdependence of the team is one of our functional pieces, right? And then trust, so that we start to build rapport with each other. And that can be very simple. Like, why did I tell you that I was into quilting and karaoke? Because it doesn't take much for humans as pack animals to start to see each other as real people. It really doesn't take that much. And so if you start to build in just a little bit of chatter time into your meetings during the day, if you're remote, or if you schedule it so that most people's breaks are at the same time and they're walking out to get water or Coke together, that can have a really high impact on the efficiency of that team going forward. And it's kind of intuitive, like, yeah, the more you talk to each other, the more you're going to know about each other or whatever, but you can engineer that. You can actually change policy to make teams be a little bit closer to each other. So defining those roles a little bit, and I'm not saying get a manager to define the roles, right? I'm saying like talk amongst yourselves and try to be like, hey, I would prefer to take this part of the project, and maybe you guys, what are you interested in doing? Can we figure out a way that I can participate in this part of it? Because this is what I really want to learn. Is a perfectly good way to start in a forming team. Sometimes you are the forming member of a team that already exists, right? And now you're coming into first day of a new school, but it's like sophomore year and everyone else already knows each other. That is a different set of things, but it's very similar. Now what you're doing is asking for the rules. Like, hey, how often do you guys meet? Make sure I'm on all the calendar invitations, right? It's like a simple onboarding kind of thing. For storming, I have been on teams that were storming for like literal actual years, and none of us really understood that this was something that we were supposed to move through, right? Because it seemed like when you have just like crappy personalities on your team, that this is an intractable problem. But I will tell you that most people don't want to be uncomfortable on their team, and they generally don't want to be the crappy person on their team. You'll run into people who are just dicks for the sole purpose of being dicks, but that's not generally how people operate, right? So sometimes there's like an element of emotional intelligence that's really advantageous here if you have it, and you can key in on those people and you can be like, hey, what is the deal? Why do you always say the most negative thing you possibly can first, right? Like, is that a way? You might know people who have this skill, right, where they can just ask anybody anything and people don't take offense and they're like not defensive about it. It's definitely like, it's both a personality type and a skill you can develop. But what you can do here, because criticism and conflict is actually kind of healthy on a team if you can work through it. So if you can refocus on your mutual goals, like, hey, I realize that you have tried, 50 other things here, but if you can just commit to this one thing, one more thing, let's try this other thing. Let's focus on our mutual goal, which is to get through this. And try to introduce that element of openness, right? Where Duncan, you said to this woman, I'm not coming back in. It is unreasonable for us to be here on a Sunday. That was probably the first time she ever heard anyone tell her that, right? Because people just don't. These are the kind of things that you can like try to, you don't have to be mad about it. You don't have to be aggressive about it, but you can just be like, we appear to be storming here. This is one of the advantages of knowing this, is that you can say like, wow, we're in a terrible storming stage and we don't seem to be getting out of it. I can say that to teams at ThoughtWorks all the times, right? Because we move very fluidly in and out of our teams as we go from client to client. I'm going to join a team that's already in flight. I'm going to have to throw together a team within a week, and we're going to have to partner up and then be a team with a client team. So it becomes a muscle that you can exercise. And we get really good at just being very open, because it's the fastest way to get past storming. And then norming, this is where, okay, yeah, real opinions start to show up, maybe some nicknames, maybe some inside jokes. It feels like we're being productive. It feels like we're settling into our groove. And what you can especially do here, and this is why there's a lot of agile ceremonies that are dedicated to feedback, is that you can start to take feedback for process improvement. So continual improvement is a real thing in a norming team, but it's really hard to have a continual improvement in a storming team. But this is where you can start bringing that to play. Like, hey, can we just look at this stuff that we did, a month and a half ago? Maybe we need to refactor this code that we did 6 months ago, because we know a lot more now about how to work in this language, and it's looking kind of like crappy and clunky. So that idea that we've been able to make it through the storm, and we've been able to have conflict and emerge stronger for it, is a very powerful part of your norming. And the other part of norming is you can be really explicit about writing down what the norms are, so that if somebody comes into the team and they say, what are the rules? You can be like, these are the rules, right? Like, this is how we operate on this team. And the more explicit you are able to be, the more articulate you can be about what those norms are, the easier they are, first of all, to address, like if they're not working for everybody, like, this doesn't make any sense to me, or this makes me feel like I'm an outsider, whatever that norm might be. And to adapt them, right, as you go. Like this, we don't actually do this anymore, is a perfectly valid thing to do with a norm, is toss it out, because we don't use it as a team anymore. And so performing would just be that one more step higher, right? Like that weightlessness, or the feeling that we're really a sum of, the team is greater than the sum of its parts. I think this is what the military sells. I don't know if they always achieve it. Maybe you guys have experienced that, that this does happen on the military, but they certainly have done a lot of study about how to make this happen in their high performing teams.
Kelly,
any questions on this one?
Question?
Sure, go ahead.
I see that it says stages, but I think you implied this. It's not like it's not like necessarily it moves from one to the next or anything like that. I'm curious, like, this is just an open question. Then also, like, let's say a small team of 4, can you have each person in a different stage at the same time of that team? Or like, I'm just kind of curious about how that plays out.
Well, you can certainly have people who feel differently about what's happening. Like, you can have people who are totally oblivious to the fact that like 2 people haven't talked in 6 months or something like that, right? So this is intended to convey information about team psychology or organizational group psychology. That's what this series is for. If I'm like an outsider looking into your team, I should be able to place your team wise into one of these places. If some people think that it's going great and some people don't, I would put you in storming, right? Like, or possibly forming, like where people just don't have the vocabulary or the recognition of what's going on. But yeah, it's absolutely possible that individuals like have a really different experience about what's going on, which is why being explicit and stating things out loud and be like creating that culture of openness is really powerful. Because sometimes you really have to work to get your more introverted members to be like, I think everything you guys have said for the last 3 months is crap. Like that's a hard thing to hear, but it's also a really hard thing to say for a lot of people because they didn't commit early and now they're just kind of left on the fringes. So there's a certain amount of like, go back and collect those people that have to happen in those cases. But yeah, you're right that these are a little bit fluid. This does make it look like first you form and then you storm and then you norm. I think people go through storming and forming stages continually, or sorry, storming and norming, where, you know, like a new person joins or we get a new assignment or somebody gets a promotion or right, like any of those things can change the dynamics on the team. And you might have to go back and resettle and then come back into your norming. But it is that feeling that once you've made it through that cycle once, you recognize it and you can make it through faster the next time. Performing, I would say you like reach the lofty heights once in a while. It's like Icarus, you know, touching the sun. And then it's like, then somebody leaves to go, you know, on maternity leave or something. And you're like, crap, here we go again. So this will be another good thing if you walk into teams, you know, in your future employers to like start to figure out like what stage are these people in? Do they have explicit rules that I should be following? Like how do I onboard here? So we talked a little bit about this company you may have heard of, Google, who did that research to figure out like what are the things that people have in common? Well, what do they have in common? Anyone have any guesses?
Diversity.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's I love that answer. Anyone else? Anyone else?
I would imagine that they set clear expectations.
Clear expectations, great.
They have good communication and they're open about their thoughts.
Yep. Also great answer.
They were goal-oriented and focused on solving the problem.
These are great answers. This is what Google found. It boiled down to psychological safety and equal airtime. So those of you who are thinking like openness, that does contribute to psychological safety. That's that feeling that we were describing earlier, where I think James said, you know, he had a manager or a boss who acknowledged his fallibility and was willing to hear questions from him. So that idea that like, we're going to make it out of the forming stage where I'm at first day at a new school and I don't want to put my whole ideas forward yet. On a good team, people will commit their ideas, even if they get shot down ultimately, because they know that there's no blame associated with that. There's not repercussion for being wrong in the way that there sometimes is. Psychological safety is the expectation that you are going to contribute and commit to the team goal. Equal airtime is literally, if I talk for 3 minutes, you talk for 3 minutes. If I talk for 7 minutes, you talk for 7 minutes. And there are other studies where people wore biometric devices where they like explored the energy and the engagement of teams by how many times people talk to each other, that really quantify that equal airtime thing as like a really interesting thing that you can map. Super fascinating study. So psychological safety and equal airtime. If you can create a team with openness where everyone is contributing and everyone feels like they can contribute and they know they're expected to, that is what characterized Google's highest performing teams, which operated on average about 20 to 25% better than their other regular Google teams. So was it worth it to them to discover how kind of boiled down to that? Yes, it was, because it created that awareness and that vocabulary and the permission to talk about things. Now, if I have a problem with someone on my team, I'm not going to go like whining to my manager at lunch. I'm going to be like, I got to talk to that guy. We have to hash this out because this is a problem for our team that we don't get along. And from Google's perspective, they also discovered that, you know, emotional intelligence is as important to them as IQ. So if you get, you know, 6 people coming out of MIT and they're all awesome technologists, but they don't know any of this and they all want to cowboy up on their job and not talk to people, right? They want to be like the manager who wouldn't let us go home on Super Bowl Sunday. That's not a good team, right? That's just pure IQ does not constitute a good team. It enabled them to restructure their incentives around teams rather than around individuals. And it enabled people to speed through that storming stage, no matter how frequently it happened, right? So whether it happened just one time, which is probably not true, or if it happened as a cycle, people could recognize it and they could be like, looks like we're storming again. What are we going to do about it? So these are things that you can take with you as you move. So I'm pretty much run ourselves out of time here, but I do have a couple that if folks will indulge me. Is that okay? Anchor? I'm not sure who. Who's
Yeah,
gonna talk now.
yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we definitely want to finish.
Okay, cool. So this is just the opposite of that paradigm, right? So the absence of trust, this is the 5 dysfunctions of a team. So we know how teams form and how they can form well and how they form predictably. They also can form predictably badly. And that all starts with the absence of trust. So that psychological safety that you're not building, well, what that means is I'm never going to get out of my first day at school feeling that I'm not going to commit. And if I don't commit, and if I'm not willing to like argue with you about the best way of doing something, there's that artificial harmony, which some of you may recognize from, you know, familial relationships of the it's fine variety. It's fine. No, it's fine. No, don't worry about it. It's fine. Like, that's not true. Whatever else you're doing, that's not true. So I won't belabor the point here. Basically, it means if you're not willing to put your ideas into the kitty, then you're not going to commit to what comes out of the committee, right? Like I had nothing to do with this. It wasn't my idea. I didn't even support it, but they did it anyway. That's like, as you go up, it all is foundational. If you can't build that trust, then you're going to have problems all the way up the chain. So a couple other tools for you guys as you head out into your technical careers. One important thing would be to know yourself. This is a great, great book. If you're not the kind of person who's ever had to have these conversations before and you're not sure that you can, read Crucial Conversations in your plenty of spare time. And this is kind of a BuzzFeed-esque little quiz that is within the text of that book. How often do you, like, how do you react in situations of conflict, right? Like you yourself. I was not that surprised to recognize myself as a withdrawer, right? When in series of conflicts, what I'm going to do is basically like smirk at you and I'm not going to engage, which is a super irritating and passive aggressive thing to have on a team, right? And I can feel myself doing this when I'm on teams now, and I have to combat it actively. So if you know how you're going to react, then that goes a long way towards building the EQ about how other people are reacting and why. Crucial Conversation is a great, great book. I really wish it had been written when I was a lot younger in my career. It would have helped me a lot. And then what Bravo Company was running into was they were having a trouble making decisions. And so somebody tried to seize control and they tried to do the Korean dictator version of how to make a decision on the team. And when they got called out for that, the problem was they went all the way to the other end of the spectrum of decision making and they went to conform. Everyone agrees that it's the exactly right thing to do. And we all believe with our heart of hearts that this is true. That's really slow. And it almost never actually happens, right? This happens a lot in not-for-profits, the conform thing, like where everyone you have to be a true believer or we're going to kick you to the curb. That's a really slow way of building coalitions. Consult, by the way, the reason I have Abraham Lincoln there, there's a book called Team of Rivals, where he had lawyers of the day argue the cases of the day, meaning the policy decisions that he was going to opine on. And he basically took their advice and made the decision, right? That's the consulting model, is you're asking a bunch of experts, but you still decide. But what actually helps a team make decisions quickly, and we do this all the time at ThoughtWorks, and you'll see dot voting a lot of times if you guys have been using dot voting to decide what you're going to do, that's just consent. It's consent of the governed. I don't agree that this is where we're going to go, but I'm still going to commit, right? I'm still going to be able to like pull on my big girl pants and play the game with you for the rest of the time that we do it your way instead of my way. This is a good norm to establish with your team at the beginning. Like, hey, let's make decisions by like dot voting or something. It can be anonymous, but it should still be the fastest way to get to the decisions you need to make. If I am living on the fringes of that complex system and I want to take advantage of the opportunities that are whizzing by me out there, I need a fast way to make decisions about which way we're going to go. The important thing to remember in an agile team is that if we try something and we don't do it right and it fails, we have the psychological safety to say, whoops, that's not working. Let's try something else, right? Let's try to take advantage of this in a different way. So rapidity is actually a very important key element of agile teams as well. And this is Amy Edmondson. She's professor at Harvard. She kind of recycled the idea of psychological safety. It also was a psychological term in the 60s and 70s, but she kind of like dusted it off and started using it in academic and business engagements. And she too says that psychological safety is absolutely necessary in situations of uncertainty and interdependence. And where have we heard that before? Oh yes, it describes both our complex system and the integrated cross-functional team that we want to work in. So psychological safety is absolutely necessary, both for those managers to devolve power down to the ranks, and for our team to have for our teams to be reliable to each other, and for us to start being vulnerable and fallible within those teams. And how do you do that? Well, a lot of times it's just being fallible, right? That's number 2 right there. Acknowledge that you don't know everything. Managers have to acknowledge that now. They can't know everything. And frame these as learning problems, not as execution problems. A lot of times you'll hear somebody be like, okay, guys, how are we going to do this? Which is a really like, I don't know, how are we going to do this? But if you flip that a little bit and say, what would need to be true for this to happen, right? That's almost the same question, but it's a little bit different. And it frames it as a learning, as like an exploration. Oh, like this is really intriguing. How do we solve this interesting problem? Modeling curiosity, same idea. And then establish those explicit norms so that you can examine them and see if they're still working for the group. This is a way to start to build psychological safety in your forming stages. So a little bit like the short form on remote teams is it's harder, and you have to double down on all of those things, right? You have to make extra effort with remote teams to make them be valuable. This is Patrick Lencioni. He's the same dude who just gave us that pyramid of the 5 dysfunctions of the team. So he also was examining the dysfunctions of remote teams, and Google did that as well, right? And so you'll see that 2 out of 3 of these are know each other better, like forge connections, build that time into the meetings that you need to have, get to know people's schedules, right? Like if I always have to pick up my kids at 7, everyone on my team should know that about me, right? Like I don't have to share like my deepest innermost secrets, by the way, and I don't have to stop being an introvert to be good on a team like this. People just have to know enough about me so that they can cover for me and I can cover for them. And we can start to share our opinions and commit to things. Okay, so these are this whole pile of questions for what kind of organization you might want to end up at. You can just ask simple questions like, am I on a dedicated team? Do I work for business or do I work in the IT department? Am I interviewing with team members or am I just interviewing with management? Because if I'm on a team with somebody, I want to be interviewing them before they come on board, right? Like I want to know if they're going to fit into my process or not. Who else is on my team? Is it just other technologists or is it cross-functional? Do I have any product people or any non-developers on my team? Do I mostly work alone? If I'm remote only, how does that work for you guys? These are the kinds of things that you can bring into your interviews as you go forward. I don't know that you can bring them into your internships that Code Platoon will set up, but at least these are the kinds of things you can be thinking about. So your takeaways: group work, suck it up. It's the new reality. It's not going anywhere. And for some people, this is going to be really easy to embrace, like, hooray, I get to work in a group. And for some people, it's like, ugh, not really what I was looking for. But even if you're an introvert, or even if you're not good at these things, you can become better and you can really have an influence on the environment that you're in. So embrace your soft skills and build that psychological safety. And then, as this fellow says, Sheldon Patinkin, who started Second City, he said, the ensemble, this is kind of a weakest link, but I like it because it's a little different. It's only as strong as its ability to compensate for its weakest members. And that weakest member can be any of us at any given time. So that's it. I'll send you the deck. I will also request some feedback from you guys, which I love to give because I love tweaking this so that it's more useful for the folks who are going through this program. Happy to answer any questions. If you have time, I can hang out. And feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn or email, or otherwise I will see you all at graduation.